好，现在我们马上将会进入今天论坛的第一场平行论坛，会聚焦中美关系以及在经贸科技领域的新动向。有请我们线下的嘉宾上台。唐老师可以把口罩摘掉。谢谢。好，先请允许我为大家介绍一下出席今天这场讨论的各位嘉宾。首先，在线上我们邀请到的是 Mr. Stephen Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S.China Relations. Welcome. And Mr. Joshua Cooper Ramos, CEO and Chairman of SORNE, former Vice Chairman and Co-CEO of Kissinger Associates. Welcome. 在线下我们邀请到的是对外经贸大学法学院洪田讲席教授、中国证监会原副主席高希庆，高老师欢迎。中国社会科学院荣誉学部会员、美国研究所研究员陶文昭先生，陶老师欢迎。And last but not the least, Mr. Li Cheng, Director of the John Thornton China Center and Senior Fellow in the Foreign Program at Brookings. Welcome. Welcome you all to participate in today's forum. 好，首先我想请问的是陶老师。陶老师，我们知道美国新一届政府上台以来，其实从某种程度上来说，中美关系可以说是已经停止了一个自由落体式的下滑的状态，虽然没有出现明显的好转，所以大家也关心中美关系未来会怎么走。那您作为一个历史学家，您认为我们现在在当下如何从过去的历史中去吸取经验，来给我们提供借鉴？
No, we are in the third rebuilding of China-U.S. relations since the founding of the People's Republic of China. The first rebuilding just happened 50 years ago when President Nixon paid an ice-breaking journey to China and ended by the normalization of the bilateral relations and Mr. Deng Xiaoping's visit to the United States immediately after the normalization. That rebuilding terminated the hostility between China and the United States and opened a new era for Sino-American relations and also brought a lot of benefits to Asia-Pacific as well as the world. The second rebuilding took place during the Clinton administration when President Clinton and President Jiang Zemin met in October 1995 in New York. The two leaders reached consensus of a constructive engagement. And after a lot of preparation, including President Jiang Zemin's state visit to the US in October 1997, and President Clinton's return visit to China in June 1998, we completed the second rebuilding. And thanks to that rebuilding, the bilateral relations lasted for more than 20 years. We had a relatively healthy and smooth development, and we were able to resist to the shocks such as the embassy bombing incident. Now we are in the third rebuilding of the bilateral relations because of the three reasons. First, Donald Trump brought complete harm to the Sino-American relations, and I think every aspect suffered a lot. Second, since the 1990s, situation in the international relations in China and in US greatly changed. Third one, and we need a lot of regulations to manage our relationship. So I think last year is the first stage of the third rebuilding of China-US relations. In this stage, as you just mentioned, we stopped the free fall of Sino-American relations, and leaders' contacts, high-level dialogues were resumed, And from the U.S. side, President Joe Biden and other high-level officials made a number of commitments or promises not to seek conflict with China, not to seek new Cold War with China, not to support the Taiwan independence, not to seek to change China's system, not to oppose China through strengthening alliances, etc. But not all the news are positive. As you just mentioned, Biden administration basically inherited the hard policy, tough policy towards China. And so now, this year and in the following years, I think we need to strengthen the functional contacts, functional engagements, functional exchanges between China and the United States, whether economic, military, people-to-people, university, and etc. All aspects.
But that can be really hard when the political relation is not good. What do you think?
Oh, I think all these aspects should go ahead. We should not wait. We should not wait until political relations completely change. No, not wait. Just every aspect, we should just begin our dialogue, our contacts, our exchanges, and then we will change the whole atmosphere.
To push it all together,
yes.
at all front.
Yes.
Thank you. But still, there are still a lot of challenges ahead when we're entering into the third phase of a rebuilding of Sino-US relations. So next I want to turn to Mr. Orleans. I know you have been living in China for a long time and watching Chinese policies very closely. So you know there are people in China and the US saying that the reason for the Sino-US relation is deteriorating is the misperception from the US, especially from the US politician. They see China as a strategic competitor. So what do you think? Do you really see China is an economic and military threat to the US?
First, I'm surprised you didn't ask me why I'm wearing a tuxedo tonight. First, it's great to see Professor Tao Gao-Shiqing and two of my directors, Li Chung and Joshua Ramo, who are directors of the National Committee. And I'm wearing a tuxedo tonight because tomorrow at the Nixon Library, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. And we're doing it precisely on the night that Zhou Enlai hosted President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger at the banquet at the Great Hall of the People. And the Nixon Library will be serving the same dishes. And it's a celebration. So I have a red bow tie on and my tuxedo for this celebration. But I have to say, I don't feel celebratory tonight. That the genius of the Shanghai Communique, of Mao, of Zhou Enlai, of President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger, was while our societies disagreed on all these things, they recognized we needed to work together. And the reason that we needed to work together was the Soviet Union, that it was a threat to China's north, it was a threat to the United States. 50 years later, as we celebrate that, I am deeply troubled by China's position
我们又受到了一定的挑战，而现在呢，比如说中国对待乌克兰事件的立场，甚至也会是一个挑战。既然谈到了要重建，可能任何的重建都需要先破才能立。那么今天早上，中国政府说，外交部发言人说，我们的这种制裁是非法的。我们对俄罗斯的制裁是非法的，它可能未必有效，但是不是非法的。中国和俄国、俄罗斯好像现在成为了世界的对立面，所以我们为什么要庆祝50周年呀？我其实非常担忧关于目前俄乌事件的局势的进展。我们看到在乌克兰发生了大量的死亡事件，
is not strongly enough supporting the views of Zhou Enlai,
支持周恩来的观点方面
and territorial
立场
integrity.
并不鲜明。
That Wang Yi's statement Saturday
王毅
morning
在
was good, but
周六
nowhere
上午的
sufficient.
声明呢是
And
好
to
的，
say that
但是
sanctions
不
are
够有效。
illegal, I just
他们
kind of
说
go, wow.
这
That's
个
just
制裁是
not
非法
what
的，
China
我
should
非
be
常震
doing.
惊。中
China
国不
should
应
be
该说
trying
出
to
这样的言论。
restrain
中国
Russia because
应
it's
该去控制
consistent
俄
with
罗斯，
Chinese foreign policy, and
制
because
止
the
它。
damage that is going to be done to China's relationship to the world is very, very significant. And the rebuilding that I hope should be occurring now will be put off for many, many years, maybe a generation. This is very serious, and I hope all of my friends on the other side of the Pacific understand just how serious this is.
I know the US and EU has put really tough sanctions on Russia, including individuals and major financial institutions. But do you think that sanctions could really change the situation, could change what is happening?
Hopefully, it will make the Russians think about it when they begin to really fight. It's better than NATO and the US sending troops and creating a world war. So the United States is left with an extremely difficult decision. Do we confront Russia and fight a war? I don't think the American people want to do that. Or do we try these sanctions? Are they perfect? Have they worked historically? They have had effect. You know, I was in the State Department when we had a boycott of South Africa. That certainly did have an effect on the ending of apartheid in South Africa. So it can work. China needs to decide where it is going to be on these issues. Is it going to work with the EU and the United States on trying to restrain Russian behavior? Because my understanding is this is going to be catastrophic.
Well, thank you for your sharing on the Ukrainian issue. But I want to go back to our question before. What do you think about the misperception by the U.S. politician? Do you think is there a misjudgment by the U.S. politicians of China?
There certainly is a lack of nuance among American political leaders in their understanding of China. That everything is negative, everything is wrong, everything is a human rights disaster, everything is foreign policy aggression. There is no understanding of the good things that China does in foreign policy. I mean, I've often asked people, who's the largest P5 provider of peacekeeping troops in the United Nations? No American can answer that because the answer is China, and nobody wants to give China credit for that. Nobody wants to give China credit for lifting, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, for creating economic growth in the world that has really been very positive. So yes, I think it lacks nuance, but there are a lot of things that both governments can do to try to improve, as you said earlier, the political relationship between the United States and China.
Yes, I do agree that both sides definitely needs that positive side. And next I want to turn to Mr. Li Cheng. Well, thank you for participating in today's forum. And as a top member in the think tank, what is your general assessment of the current Sino-US relations? Do you think it has improved generally?
Well, before answering your question, I want to say a few things. First of all, just like Steve talked about his tuxedo and also red tie, I also want to mention I wear a tie of tiger. Not only I went to Princeton, which it has the tiger, it's a symbol, but also, of course, it's China's Lunar Year, Happy New Year. And also congratulations for China's, hosting the Beijing Olympics. This is also, I saw Joshua Ramo. He was actually the commentator for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. I had fond memories about his remarks in that also historical moment. Now, I would like to say a few words before answering your question on my strategic reflection of this anniversary. The Nixon-Kissinger opening of China was first and foremost a strategic move that not only helped and 2 decades of mutual hostility between the United States and China, but also profoundly changed the geopolitical landscape at the time. From the American perspective, this historical trip elevated U.S. leverage in the trilateral relationship. But from a broader perspective, it contributed to enhancing the prospects for peace and stability in the world, and eventually led to the end of the Cold War. For me and for many others my age, like Gao Xiqing, who grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution and during the Cold War, the opening of China was not only a turning point in history, but also an event that changed our lives and the lives of millions. Now, for your question about the change and the status of the Biden administration's China policy, there are some important differences between Trump and Biden in their policy toward China, as Professor Tao Wenzhao also mentioned. I very quickly mentioned that the difference. The Trump administration, in its final year after March of 2020, when COVID was out of control in the US, decided to viciously confront China on the following 5 fronts. Economically, Trump's hawkish team called for a systematic and complete decoupling with China. Politically, it pursued regime change to overthrow CCP rule. On the societal front, senior officials claimed that the threat from China to be a whole of society threat, and proposed banning the visa for CCP members and their families, a total of 300 million people. And on the military and security front, they plan to officially support Taiwan's independence. Now, Biden administration is different on all these 4 fronts. Due to time constraint, I will not elaborate. Actually, Professor Tao Wenzhao already mentioned some of them. Now, perhaps the most impactful differences between Trump and Biden is that Trump did not care about the coalition building and alienated American allies with American first, American alone, while Biden has placed priority on improving US relations with allies in Europe and Asia. Now, in the interest of US, Biden's approach is wise. Objectively, Washington has legitimate reasons to protect and advance its own vital interests. Now, what went wrong on the part of the Biden administration? I believe Biden's approach has 3 serious deficiencies. First, the US-led anti-China coalition has failed to show a clear line between legitimate competition with China and the Cold War-like confrontation. So boundless stiff competition, especially Biden's demand for countries in Europe or Asia to take a side, does not work well. Many of these countries are aligned with the US in ideology, but they don't want to have a new Cold War with China. Second, about 130 countries and the regions count China as their largest trading partner, compared to 57 for the United States. Among EU countries, for example, China has been Germany's largest trading partner for 5 consecutive years. Now, this year's implementation of the RCEP, which includes American allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, as well as the ASEAN countries, reinforces China's economic leverage. And the third, perhaps most importantly, Biden's anti-China coalition has pushed China to accelerate its collaboration with Russia and Iran. Steve Allen just mentioned China's position on Ukraine. Now, despite the absence of an ideological glue or trust among these 3 countries, China, Russia, and Iran, they are inclined to show solidarity to combat what they perceive to be a formidable threat from the US-led military bloc. Now, this reminds me of the warning made 25 years ago by Brzezinski, a former national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter. In his 1997 classic book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski warned, I quote, potentially the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances, end quote. Now, all the above seem to illustrate the strategic deadlock and the most dangerous scenario that the Biden administration confronts now. Over.
So do you agree, like Mr. Orleans just said, that Ukraine could be a new uncertainty to the Sino-US relations?
Well, of course, that it's still too early to say. I think Tony Blinken called Wang Yi. I think they want to talk about the Ukraine situation. And also, it's interesting to know a few days ago in Australia, the so-called Quad, they did not talk too much about China. And again, Wang Yi also in his speech mentioned about the sovereignty issue. But on the other hand, the general public opinion in China certainly biased, more critical of the United States. And for many people in China, maybe elsewhere, think the economic sanction hardly work regarding China or other countries, maybe except in South Africa many decades ago. So that's the Chinese attitude. So I see my good friend Steve's point, but I think the Chinese certainly take a different perspective to a certain extent that some people think that the United States pushed China towards, kind of a closer relationship with the other two countries.
And back to the point when you're talking about competition, especially the Biden administration is pulling its allies to form an anti-China coalition to compete with China. But when we are talking about competition, the both sides have also stressed that we don't want to turn the competition into conflict. So in your view, how can we going to do that?
Well, it's very difficult because you, first of all, if we define the policy as a strategy, as a competition, you probably will put that as a driver's seat. And they will not talk about too much about cooperation. This is exactly happened in Washington, D.C. I can give you numerous examples that we're really overly concerned about the so-called China's threat and China's advantage, and in technology, in military, in various other things. So that's the reality we face. Now, it's also important to know that this kind of view also exists in the other side. The Pacific Chinese also emphasize on competition in many ways. So I think that that's an unfortunate situation. Certainly reminds me that Henry Kissinger and also my friend and Susan Sontag, both of them actually said years ago that overly emphasis on stiff competition may lose the big picture. I certainly agree with Dr. Kissinger and Susan Sontag on that view, but that's a reality we face.
Yes, definitely. There is a lot of wisdom that we have to learn from the history. Next, I want to turn to Mr. Ramo, and thank you so much for participating online. I know you once brought up the concept of Beijing Consensus, and you have a really deep understanding of Chinese development model. So in your view, do you see that China is a strategic competitor to the U.S.?
First, let me just start by saying what a pleasure it is to see friends healthy and well on the screen, some of whom I've seen in person, but it's not anything that I think any of us can take for granted. And let me join Chung Li in wishing everybody the best for Happy New Year's and congratulations on the safe, successful completion of the Winter Olympics, which I think all of us had the chance to watch and observe, and I think made a tremendous impact on the world. To answer your question, I was over the summer in Beijing for the 50th anniversary of Dr. Kissinger's secret trip, and had the opportunity to be in Diaoyutai State Guest House at the exact moment 50 years earlier that Dr. Kissinger had arrived with his group, in that remarkable period in Chinese history and world history, and was very much struck at that event in which Vice President Wang Qishan gave quite a moving speech about just how much work it took to get to that point and the remarkable efforts of all sides across many years that subsequently followed that. And I think, the first thing to say as we sit here, it's interesting, 50 years ago right now, Richard Nixon and his wife were visiting the Great Wall, which Nixon, uttered his famous line when he saw it, "It sure is a great wall." And then that evening, on the evening of the 24th, at the Great Hall of the People, had a 3-hour meeting with Zhou Enlai that started at 5:15 and ended at 8:15, in which they addressed in a comprehensive and philosophical way the challenges that the two countries faced and approached it from a very interest-based calculation, which allowed them to move forward. I think there are some important lessons from that engagement, and I'm always encouraging people to go back and read the full transcript of those communications, because the thoughts and the intentions of those statesmen reflected the nature of the age in which they live. The first thing I think that was very clear was really a desire and a curiosity to try to understand the interests of each side, and understand that diplomacy was not simply about asserting your interests, but the work of that, anybody can do that. The hard work of diplomacy is actually finding ways to bridge the interests of each side, and assuring that there are ways to do that in very difficult times and facing very difficult circumstances, I think is the efforts that have gone on continuously and that mark that first exchange. The second thing that I think marked that exchange, and you really see it when you go back and look at the documentation, is that the leaders were placing China-US relations in a much larger global context. Both sides are very straightforward in talking about the nature of the age in which they were living, and that they were doing things based on their own interest in confronting the challenges of that age. And I think that is another important historical lesson that everybody should keep in mind. And the third thing I think that is remarkable and important is it does show the powerful value of person-to-person contact, of having channels of communication that are not just video channels, but that are human channels. And that, like everything in life, the more surface area you can create, the better you're able to solve problems. So I think that really is the basis on which we need to consider all questions. But I think particularly as we sit here thinking about what was happening 50 years ago at that extraordinary moment, the right way to think about it from a historical perspective.
Well, thank you for taking us back to that, the time of history. And but unfortunately, as you just mentioned, it seems that we don't have the environment or the atmosphere to cooperate or to communicate. And moreover, in the
Actually,
US...
that's not what I said. That's not what I said. That may be your opinion, but that's not what I said.
But what concerns me is that in the US, staying tough on China seems to be a rare bipartisan issue right now. So what do you think are the reasons behind it?
Well, again, first of all, just to clarify what I said is that the important thing is to first understand what the larger nature of the age demands, and then believe that it is possible against that background to do the difficult work of diplomacy, which is to roll up your sleeves and find ways to bridge the interests of both sides. I think the nature of political evolutions in any country are subject to both internal and external factors. And I think those factors ebb and flow, they change over time. And I think it's important not to believe that a situation that you face today is going to be the same situation that you're going to face in 20 years. I can tell you one of the benefits for me of having had the good fortune to spend many years examining China and living there and spending time with people is the constant reminder that the oldest book in Chinese culture is the Book of Changes. And I think on that basis, you can take any existing situation and understand that it really is just a temporary expression of underlying energies. And the challenge, again, really is how do you use and direct those energies in a productive way?
Well, thank you, Mr. Ramo. And now I want to turn our guest offline, Mr. 高希庆。高老师您好，我知道我们今天也是一个纪念的日子啊，一直在回顾一些这个中美之前的交往。我知道您也是中国改革开放之后最早一批赴美留学的中国学生，也参与了很多中美在这个金融领域的交流的工作啊。那在您看来哈，您刚才之前也说过，中美之间再也回不到过去的好日子了。今天能不能跟我们分享一下过去的那个好日子是一个什么样的状态？
我用英文回答。
都可以。
Okay, first of all, I have to clarify. I didn't really say that the Sino-American relationship will never go back to the good old days. I just said, well, for a while, it looks like it's it's really, we probably could see it going down a little bit more. But as we say in the Bible, this too will pass. We Chinese have this sort of very long-term views about the history, and also even the Westerner. I've seen a Russian
Kondratiev gave us this wisdom of a 60-year big cycles. I believe in that. If you look back to the past at least 300, 400, 500 years, every 60 years there will be a total turnover. And I think right now we are on the downturn. We have probably a few more years to go down. But in the long run, I don't think it's going to go down. Because just on the personal level, because of my, all my experiences with Americans and all these years in China on both sides, and observing so many Chinese being educated in the U.S. and so many Americans coming to China, staying in China. Both Joshua and Steve, you guys are all, have so many contacts in China, talking with so many people so long. I just think that you understand China a lot better. But at the same time, even though when people are complaining about this 小粉红, the little pinkies who are complaining, who are being educated in the U.S. but complaining all the time about Americans, this will pass. This, because in the end of the day, people are people, and we are, everyone has very, very personal experiences with the people around them. And at the time when I went to the U.S. in 1982, and people kept asking me, how was China like? Do you have trees there? Do you have pens? At the time, the mutual understanding was so little that, because when I was in China, we were supposedly studying American culture and American language. And we had a chance to see one foreign movie in English, not even American, German or Russian movie, or even Korean movie in English, 1 or 2 movies each year. So by the time I got to San Francisco in 1982, that was a true cultural shock. But over the years, when I talked to so many people, when I've been constantly questioned, asked, and suspected of doing something for a foreign government, over the communications with all these people, either my friends in Duke Law School or in law firms, eventually people all start to understand, and they know that this is something that we will have to work together with, and we Chinese as Americans are humans, and there are problems, differences we have, but there are so many more common points that we have than things that we don't agree with each other. And the same is true with all these Americans whom I have been dealing with in China over the past 30-some years since I came back from the U.S. And many of them had bad experiences in China, saying, oh, I was mistreated here, mistreated there, and they complain about things. But, over the long run, except in a few exceptions, but most of the people who go back to the U.S. now come back and say, well, if you really, on the larger scale, if you look at it, China has done tremendously in so many things. We disagree with a lot of things that the Chinese people are saying or the Chinese government is saying, but overall, China has done so much better than anyone could imagine 30 years ago. Just look at, the number of people who were lifted out of the poverty. Just look at all the high-speed trains. Look at all the general cognizance of people about personal freedom, about free travel, about, just like what is going on in the internet right now, about a woman's, being treated, and all these things. This is something that's so much more, common in us rather than differences in us. Therefore, I think it's right now, there's a point when we are sort of concentrating on the differences, saying, oh, this is so bad, we're not going to go back to the good old days. But after a while, people would understand it. The fact that people talk about Mr. Trump, talk about certain people in China, they call it the warring wolves and these things. These are always there. It's not just today. Even in the 80s, when in the U.S., when people today think back, thinking that we were in sort of honeymoon time or honey decade time, even at that time, I was constantly being asked by people at Duke, at places, and say, well, I'm abhorred at your system. These people later all became my friends. I was a member of the Duke Law soccer team, and these people, when we talk, they just say, oh, I have problems with your government. I said, why? What problems do you have? We started to talk. Now we're all very good friends. These people all work on in their respective places, working on things between the two countries. So I think in the long run, we're going to be doing better. I don't believe that things are only going to what we call the dark forest period.
Yeah, from a bigger picture, from a longer history, that might be just a phase. And when you're going to talk to people, start to talk to people, you realize that we're not that different. But also, one of the keywords we're talking about the current Sino-US relations is competition. And what do you think that we can do to manage that competition, that avoid that turn into a conflict? And is there going to be a new kind of relations between big powers?
I think the most important thing really is communication. Really is to get to talk to each other. Rather, in Steve's word, Steve earlier talked about the lack of nuance. I think this is very important. We cannot just deal with people as enemies. And some people treat things like that, but this is not majority of the people. And any adults who have dealt with family member problems, with the in-laws, with your general community, with people of different races, different colors, different sex, eventually all realize that it's much more beneficial to keep dialogue rather than just say, okay, forget it. I'm divorcing you, right? So I think the governments and the educated people, which is the majority now, at the time when I went to college in China, only 3% of high school graduates could go to college, and high school graduates were only a few percentage points of the population. Today, every year we have about 10 million people graduating from colleges. Okay, in the US, by the same token, many people say, oh, those rednecks, they're not educated and they believe in Donald Trump. That's just a sort of a radical sort of a thinking. But overall, at today's understanding, the level of understanding of the world, I think we all know that if we keep the dialogue, if we keep talking to each other, and if we do not have a preconceived notion against the other party, which some people have, but I believe most people, like people here, even like the people who take a sort of extreme attitude outwardly, they know that we need to look at the facts. We need to look at the logic. We need to look at everything putting together. And we need to look at the mutual benefits of our people. And eventually people will believe that let's just keep talking. Yeah. And then even though we do not disagree with each other on many things, there are so many things that we can disagree with each other. So like the French say, vive la différence, right?
Right, I totally agree.
I would like to make two supplements. First one, I just mentioned the promises made by President Joe Biden and high-level officials. I think now it is important to translate all these promises, pledges into practice. That's extremely important. And the most recent Indo-Pacific Strategy report seems to me not that good. It seems to me contradictory to Joe Biden's promise not to oppose China through strengthening alliances. And the report just sees China as a major challenge to this region. But actually, China's development has provided a lot of opportunities for the region. And until now, this region is the most vigorous, most dynamic region in the world today. Secondly, you just mentioned about competition. I think competition is nothing to be frightened of, but competition without the rules is a concern. So we need to talk about the rules of competition. China-US competition must be open, fair, and rule-based. But we have little rules about the competition. Yes, we talked some during the Obama administration, like the sea and air encounter rules, but it's not enough. For instance, drones are now popularly used, but drones are not there. So we need to talk rules in every aspect. That's, I think, extremely important.
Yes, I do agree with Mr. Gao and Mr. Tao here about keep communicating. And now, Mr. Tao here, you talked about the change in Biden-China's policy. Through that, I want to go back to Mr. Li Cheng here. Mr. Li, the same question to you, because you once said the change of China policy is because of the change of balance of power, especially China is catching up with the US in areas like technologies. So, we also know that Professor Graham Allison has brought up the concept of the Thucydides trap. So do you think that China and the US are walking into that trap?
Well, I certainly disagree with the Thucydides trap, partly because it used Asian history to apply to a globalized world in the era of technological revolution. And partly it was predetermined and fatalistic. Also, I don't see US-China relations having a so-called free fall, 垂直坠落, wherein the existing superpower and the rising superpower cannot have any prospect other than a hegemonic war. I believe that this can and should be avoided. Now, it would be naive, however, for anyone to assume that the United States and China will have an easy exit out of the current increasingly hostile situation. The world's most consequential bilateral relationship has deteriorated at a speed and a scope beyond what could have been predicted. Not only has each side accused the other of being a genocidal regime and speculated the COVID-19 pandemic originated from a lab leak in the other country, but the risk for military confrontation and war between both superpowers is on the rise. All of these show us how bad and how dangerous the bilateral relationship is now. Now, from Washington's perspective, for the first time since World War II, the US faces a country whose global economic outreach, technological potential, and comprehensive national strengths, including military power, are on par with its own. The US Congress in the first half of 2021, last year, introduced more than 300 China-related bills to restrain China's global economic outreach. Now, regardless of you agree or disagree, one can be better informed in recognizing American critics' anxiety about and the resentment of China's ever-growing economic power. The Chinese economic miracle in the reform era has come at the relative expense of America's economic status in the world. As one American official described, the global economic landscape change in China's favor represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. Now, so this is, we do need to have the empathy. We do need to understand why American public, American middle class, they think that, China's rapid growth of middle class actually happened at the time that the American middle class is shrinking. So we do need to understand that kind of mindset. I'm not saying that the US should blame China for its own economic structure or distributional problem, but let's face it, that certainly American Main Street did not benefit that much. If you look at the past 40 years economic growth in terms of 5 income group, China, all 5 income group grow, as Steve Olin said, the poverty people also got rid of poverty. And of course, some rich people become super rich. But in the US, these 5 groups, only the top 20 benefit from economic liberalization since 1980s. The other 4 groups did not. So that's explain that why so many middle class voted for Donald Trump. And also why both presidents, Donald Trump and Biden, talk about the middle class development or middle class foreign policy. Now, in that regard, I think the empathy and the mutual respect talk about the not demonize others, like Gao Xiqing mentioned, but rather to emphasize a commonality, common ground, common aspiration, but at the same time to make the cake bigger rather than just upset that Chinese are eating our lunch, or that China think that the United States benefit. Maybe Wall Street benefit, but a large number of people did not. That explains that we should pay attention to ordinary people. I noticed Ambassador Qin Gang actually recently visited the labor group in the United States and to Boston, to many other things. I think it's very, very important. Unless until China has empathy, unless until China's middle class development could be opportunity rather than threat to America, I think the bilateral relationship is in a big trouble. So, over.
Yeah, thank you for raising that great point about middle class. That may be a breakthrough while we're in this cycle of antagonism. So next, I want to move on trade. 我们知道过去几十年中美的经贸关系可以说一直是中美关系的压舱石，而且经贸的规模一直在增长。但是从18年开始，美国上届政府为了追求贸易平衡，来挑起了这个贸易战。在2020年1月份的时候，中美签订了这个第一阶段的贸易协议，可以说暂时是稳定住了两国的合作。我这里也有组数据啊，在这个协议签订以来，其实这个贸易的规模是出现了一个明显的增长的。在2020年，增长的是8.3%，2021年增长的更快，双边贸易额增长的是28.7%，而且根据这个采购的承诺，在2021年中国自美的进口是增长了32.7%，这个规模已经是很大了。所以首先还想请问高先生，就是从这个意愿上来看，看来企业还是有这个意愿去执行协议的，但是从结果上仍然没有满足，就是在协议当中约定的这个采购目标，在您看来障碍是什么？
I think because the earlier major was really in trade. At the time when I was studying foreign trade in Beijing, the American dependency of international trade was about 5%, and China's dependency of foreign trade was about 5%. So at the time we were given this in the 1970s, we were given this theorem that both countries are very big countries and quite self-reliant, so we don't need foreign trade. But that, of course, today, if you look back, well, that's about, at least that's nonsense in the case of China. United States today, still foreign dependency is not over, I think, 10%, probably lower. But China, much higher than that. That gives us this thinking that China needs the international trade a lot more than the United States. So this is, if you look back at the bigger picture, where many years ago when Nixon, opened this whole thing and we started doing it, one of the reasons, other than geopolitical thinking, one of the reasons was that no one wanted China to be one of the poorest countries in the world, and no one wanted China to be exporting refugees and these things. And it's to everyone's benefit to lift the poverty of a country, to make the country richer, which now is, we're seeing this. But if you look at the composition of trade, and everything that we're selling, but most of the things we're selling, should not be the worries of Americans, at least seems to me. Because most of the things we sell, in the early days, so baskets and cloths and these things, and we buy high standard machinery and communication equipment and these things. Today, that composition has not changed that much. If you look at things, that's why, despite Donald Trump's efforts to cut down trade, the trade is still increasing. Why? Because Americans don't want to spend all the time without their workers to produce low level products. That is perfectly fine with a typical Western economic theory. David Ricardo, all these things. This is an international division of labor. So why worry so much about it? Well, so to me, as far as trade is concerned, if we continue to allow this to go on, and everyone would be benefiting from it. But if you want to politicize that, you say, okay, China has had so much American dollars, and then they can use that with military, with everything. Hey, if you can always say that to about everything, with sort of conspiracy thinking. You have to look at the other side. We can create rules, like what doctors said about rule-based dealings with each other. And let's just do these things, and then things might go to a better place. Otherwise, people would always be concentrating on these little things.
Yes, like Mr. Gao just said, the trade is benefiting the both sides. So, Mr. Orleans, I want to turn to you. What do you think are the reasons that the first phase trade deal is not fully implemented?
It never could have been fully implemented, even if COVID hadn't hit, and then COVID made it additionally impossible. It was a deal that was flawed from its inception and should have never been signed by both sides. The tariffs that have been imposed have hurt Americans, have hurt Chinese, and haven't really produced any benefit for either side. It creates it creates trade diversion. What's important, you were talking about the Thucydides trap, and what Graham Allison meant about it is people view a rising power and the status quo power as inevitably coming into conflict. But what he was saying is we need to work to avoid that situation. It wasn't that it was inevitable. He was basically saying it's really important that we know that this often happens in history and we work to avoid that happening. And I would argue that our two governments have really not been that successful in avoiding the Thucydides trap. If you listen to my speeches, there's plenty of blame to go around. But, one of the reasons that Americans look so unfavorably on China is I get to watch Phoenix every morning in the United States. So I watch Phoenix, the info channel, quite often. I have it on in the background. If I were sitting in China and wanted to watch US news, I couldn't do it. I couldn't access Facebook. I couldn't access Google. I couldn't access YouTube. I can't access Twitter. I can't read the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. And those activities create a negative view among Americans, and that leads to us falling into the Thucydides trap. So it's really important that both governments recognize that we need to do things differently. I mean, Gao Xiqing was referring to the trade and tariffs. These tariffs are nonsensical. I am stunned that this far into the Biden administration, we still have it. China's economy would benefit from the ending of those tariffs, and lower income Americans would benefit from the ending of those tariffs. And I just, every week I say to the US government, I hope we're getting close to ending it. But the politics of it is so difficult in the United States that we may not see these tariffs end for a long time.
Yes,
Both my friends, Steve and Li Cheng, mentioned the Thucydides trap. I would say a few words about it. I don't think that power transitioning theory is fit for explaining China-US relations for several reasons. First one, I think the globalization does not concentrate power on one or two countries' hand. On the contrary, it dispersed the power of international relations, international politics to many countries. And secondly, because of participation of non-government factors like transnational cooperation, terrorist organizations, drug cartel, and cross-border crime organizations, etc. The power controlled by the countries were weakened. Those are very significant organizer or significant actors in international relations. And thirdly, United States and Soviet Union used to be bipolar in the world, but the conditions today are completely different than before. And there's a group confrontation, two camps at that time. But today, there's no groups, no camps. China's diplomacy is a non-alignment, not aiding at the third country, making partners rather than making alliances. And it is still our policy today. As Deng Xiaoping taught us, we should develop friendly relations with every country in the world. So I think, power transition theory, and yes, United States lost some power, but the power lost by the US is not transitioning to China totally. It transitioned to all the emerging economies, developing countries. And I think the good example is G20. When the developed countries could not deal with the financial crisis, they asked for new economies to join them. And also, this gives developing countries, new economy, emerging economies, opportunity to take the decision-making in international economics and finance.
Yeah, these are two totally different mentalities. And also I want to say a few things about the Thucydides trap Professor Graham Allison has raised, because he analyzed 16 cases for the past 200 years, and only 12 of them, well, it's 12 of them lead into war, but still 4 of them avoided war. So the basic thing is not that the trap is not inevitable, it's inevitable. It's just to find wisdom and ways from history to avoid going into war. And let's go back to trade, because there's one thing that really concerns China, that the USTR has published a new report, annual report on China's WTO compliance, and pointing out that China has restained and expanded its state-led and non-market style approach to the economy and trade, and saying that the US is seeking more domestic trade tools to deal with that challenge. So I want to ask Mr. Gao here, what do you think of that report and the basic tone of the Biden's trade policy towards China?
Well, it's very interesting to me because at the time when I went to the US in 1982, from 82 to about the time I came back in 88, during those years, every day when I turn on TV, turn on the radio, and everything you hear about is Japan. And American, the senators, congressmen kept talking about Japan and saying, oh, this is so bad. Japan is taking us over. They're buying over everything. Rockefeller Center, everything. And say the Japanese government is using all these unfair practices, for our people. At the time, Japan was painted as some sort of an enemy, like they constantly talk about the Pearl Harbor, about these things. Look what happened. Today, you look back, it's now, that's why some people, the cynics now start to say, oh, Americans just always need an enemy. If not Japan, and the Russians, and if not Russians, and the Chinese. Americans are, idealistic people and very enthusiastic about things. And they're, in a way, on the rank and file level, people are just, believe in things. But if you look at the numbers, if you keep, educating people, eventually people will realize these things are, they might be a problem, but we need to solve the problems. And in fact, I was thinking, the sort of consistency trap you're talking about today. In fact, the reason why China now is concentrating so much more on high tech, all the things that Americans try not to sell to China, is exactly because Americans try not to do it. You say, you're basically saying, okay, stop producing all these low-level things, just produce high-level things, compete with us. Does that make sense to Americans? For so many years, because I personally was asked to participate in many of the dialogues, from the 90s. up until the 21st century. And they were always talking about, how China should do certain things, buy things. And we always say, well, why don't you sell us these things that we'd like to buy? The chips and the certain things. Early on was the COCOM, and then later all these different gimmicks that Americans use and say, okay, we don't want to sell you this. If now today it looks like it's even more, draconian about these things. That leaves what result? China now say, okay, finally, forget about the Americans. Let's produce our own thing. Now you are really facing a real threat, at least to your competitive edge. You're basically telling China to concentrate on these trades. And so I think, in the long run, if we keep talking, of course, it makes all the sense for us to really produce our own thing. But it doesn't make sense internationally. If you think about the international division of labor, if you talk about a comparative advantage. American society has so much of an environment for creativeness, for, all these things. And if you keep on doing that, your competitive edge is there. So why the hell are you worried about it? You don't want to produce low-level things anyway, okay? So that's how I see it.
So, Mr. Ramo, I want to turn to you. Do you agree that this trade policy is not fit for the logic of globalization and comparative advantage?
If you think about generally from kind of what a trade philosophy means, the goal of successful trade, by the way, like the goal of all engagement, is to find ways in which the interests of all sides can be appropriately, balanced. The important thing, again, is to just think a little bit about the background under which all this is occurring. And I think it's important to understand that the nature of the age that we're living in, because of technological forces, is fundamentally altering the dynamic in terms of the tools of production and the nature of where value sits on the value chain. We're discovering now that the relationship between labor markets and productivity is not what we thought it was as a result of finding out certain elements of labor pressures that have emerged as a result of the COVID crisis. So I think the challenge for all trade arrangements is to try to find ways in which you can take the fundamental Ricardian principles that Dr. Gao mentioned and translate them into a set of policy prescriptions. And that's really the work that has to be done. I think the challenge is, designing a set of protocols that allows that. And then that framework of thinking about it as protocols, as thinking of the challenge as a challenge of interoperability, I think does open the space for a lot of creative thinking. The other thing I'd say is there's a tremendous amount of interesting work that has been done on the question of how you would think from a protocol approach about combining economies that are run on very different models. And when you spend time with that research, when you look at it from an economic perspective, it becomes very clear that there are probably many very healthy paths forward that allow each side to maintain its comparative advantage and get what is the great promise of trade since Ricardo, which is this idea that you can have 1 + 1 = 5.
So back to Biden's trade policy towards China, especially in that annual report released by USTR, it says it's going to seek more domestic trade tools. Does it mean more tariffs or investment barriers? What do you think?
I'm not privy to the thinking, but I think the goal has got to be to find a way that the interests of both sides can be met in a sensible fashion. And that's what's been the work of trade policy for hundreds of years. And I'd be relatively confident at some point it will reassert itself.
And now, next, I want to turn to Mr. Orleans, because I have to compare this USTR report with what Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, have said last October when she used so many positive words like it seeks durable coexistence with China and seeks to reconnect with China instead of decoupling. So do you see that report represents a change in the trade policy of the Biden's administration?
It represents more specificity and lays out areas where America's USTR hopes the Chinese change their policies. That it is a very detailed, very long, I think it's 64 pages, laying out where they believe China has not complied with its WTO obligations. So the hope is that can then lead, if China begins to comply, that can lead to what she calls the recoupling. to the extent that the USTR believes that China is in violation of its obligations, I support their position. To the extent that it is an arbitrary and capricious decision that brands certain Chinese companies, puts them on the entity list without, I don't fully understand what they're doing and whether that puts America in violation of its obligations. So I think the report is simply putting what we say meat on the bones of her statements from last year and trying to lay out where USTR believes China is not in compliance, and basically, I assume, entering into discussions with the people working for Liu He to come into compliance. I mean, the hope is, the US violates WTO, China violates WTO. The worldview is China violates much more regularly than the US, and that state subsidies play a great role in creating an uneven playing field. So in my former life, as a private equity investor, your cost of capital was critical in determining the price you would pay for an asset. If the state is subsidizing your cost of capital and providing that capital, subsidizing in effect the business, well, it's extremely difficult for truly private companies or private funds to compete. So USTR is simply laying all that out. So I'm not, I'm troubled by parts of it, but not by most of it.
Mr. Gao first, please.
I would like to counter that in a way because, we all know that the U.S. spent so much time and so much energy to try to eventually form WTO, right? And we all believed, at least for a few decades, that WTO was a very effective mechanism to try to promote international cooperation, promote international trade. But over the past few years, gradually, WTO sort of started falling apart simply because of one important thing, that the dispute resolution mechanism was being, at least as far as my knowledge, I don't know the details, but it was sabotaged, so to speak, by Americans because Americans always veto the election of the WTO court's judges. So eventually, the WTO court judge, the court has over 7 judges, but the one after the retirement of each one, gradually it fell down to 3. So you can't effectively start any court cases anymore. So you're basically throwing away the sort of international multilateral dispute resolution system where you can talk and you can say, okay, if you say China is using state power to compete against, unfairly compete against foreign, smaller private enterprise, then you can do that in a WTO mechanism because it's something that you advocated and you created, and something that China at the time gradually, when China entered the WTO, we agreed to that. But we can always try to solve that problem in that thing. But at least as far as I understand from these former WTO judges, they say, well, Americans just made it impossible. Therefore, we can't really do that anymore. Therefore, USTR, started thinking, okay, we Americans are so great, we just do it ourselves. We started just sanctioning you. That doesn't sound like a good policy to me.
Yeah, Mr. Li, please, your thinking on this issue.
I just want to add 3 points. First, in Washington, D.C., trade economic issues with China are not on the driver's seat. I think it's dominated by political, security, ideological concern, and especially that in terms of military, technological competition, ideological competition, these are the most important concern. So it's different from previous, eras. And even that the American #1 economic problem, inflation, you were saying that trade with China and China's, cooperation could reduce that, as my colleague Jeff Bader argued, but no one paid attention on that. This is number 1. Number 2, I think when you look at the U.S. administration as its different departments, they're not always coordinated well. And also the political team dominated things. So it's not a secret that some of the economic, team members may have different views. And Catherine Tai and Janet Yellen and etc. They may have their own views. So it's not a secret that, there's some different approach. This is number two. Number three, I think despite all these problems, there's always strong reason for hope in economic and trade relations. China's ambassador to U.S., Qin Gang, actually yesterday said, I just looked at his speech. He said the U.S. remains China's third largest trade partner, and with an increase of 30% in trade last year, and the total bilateral trade reaching a record high at about $756 billion. So it's not that bad in reality. Now, also I wanted to add the final point is that in the US, state and local governments are still have enormous interest in economic engagement with China. According to one American study released last year, China was the largest import partner of 15 US states, actually in the year before, 2020, including California, New York, Florida, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. These are very important states run by both Democrats and Republican governors. So that shows a completely different kind of bipartisan consensus. In the Capitol Hill, tough on China by Republicans and Democrats, but the local level is a different picture. Now, we should always remember that during the past half century of engagement with the opening to China by Nixon and Kissinger, the two largest economies in the world now have established 50 state to province partnership and more than 200 sister cities. And the state governments in the United States actually have set up a 27 representative office in China, still now, and more than in any other nations. So if these do not provide a solid foundation, what will? So I think that we should look at the different levels to see both the challenge and the opportunity, not to easily jump to the conclusion and one way or another.
Yes, I think we can all agree that trade is benefiting both sides, and inevitably it is impacted by the political relations. So I want to go back to Mr. Tao. What is your view through this trade issue being politicized?
Exactly, even during the time of a trade war between China and the United States, I still thought that trade and economic relations were the ballast of Sino-American relations. And even under high custom duties, trade relations actually developed. And in the past few years, it shows how deep interdependence do we have, the two countries have. Actually, even with Donald Trump's call for so-called decoupling, actually, it did not have any effect. And the few corporations, a few companies, left China, returned to the United States. Even some corporations left China, but they went to Vietnam, to Malaysia, not to the United States. Yeah. But I think one point we have not mentioned yet, that is the U.S. sanction, especially on high-tech companies in China. This has become more and more serious question between China and the United States. And some U.S. scholars argue that this may be counterproductive because the sanction provide a very strong dynamic for China to develop those high techniques. And now China, actually concentrates on developing chips, electronic chips, on quantum technologies, on artificial intelligence, and on some other high techniques. So I think it's not the way. It's not the way for the world to develop high-tech and the economy. And one thing I think we should especially notice, that is, we have not known yet how would be the high-tech impact to the human society. You know, we don't know yet. You know, artificial intelligence, quantum, how will change our life, everybody's life. So I think, you know, Dr. Kissinger raised that question, and some U.S. wise men raised the question. I think we should more think about that rather than to build high walls and to protect the little yard.
You're absolutely right. In the field of artificial intelligence, I think we do need cooperation globally. And the sanctions you just mentioned, it is not doing anyone any good. And Mr. Gao, I want to go to you because not only the trade, but also Chinese companies trying to go IPO in the US market, and it's been sabotaged by some US laws passed by the US Congress under the name of national security. So what do you think that is going to develop?
Well, I give you some personal experiences. Early on, when I was, first of all, when I was vice chairman at the CSRC, when China, at the time, some major Chinese companies were going to the U.S. to get listed in the early days, like you know, oil companies, PetroChina, and at the time we already signed mutual understanding, memorandum of mutual understanding with the SEC, and then. Our people said, well, our IPO proposal got stopped by the SEC. So I visited Washington, D.C., talked to them, and find out that, you know, at first the Chinese side said, well, they sent this questionnaire of 127 questions, which were totally ridiculous because they're all so detailed and everything. So they said someone was trying to sabotage them. I said, well, let's just talk to them. So I went there, talked to the SEC chairman, commissioners, and they sent in more than a dozen engineers/lawyers from there, and they genuinely tried to understand what the system is. They said, well, all these people said, well, we have never seen something like this in the world because this is a company with 1.25 million workers and with 20,000 drilling wells and all these things. So we don't know, and this company has everything ranging from a kindergarten to even airports, to everything. So, you know, we try to understand how this can work if you, after the, you know, decoupling of these, what we call social functions from the productive side. So after talks, after a while, and eventually they accepted everything. Finally, they let PetroChina, like, you know, China Oil, to get listed there. And that was a good example of how people understand each other. But then, eventually, you know, fast forward to the time when I, you know, became president and CIO of China Investment Corporation, and in 2007, 2008, we thought, you know, we could start investing in the United States and in Europe because this is very interesting. You know, all these people ask me, well, you guys have so much cash and they want to buy us out. I said, look, we have this because of your pressure, because all these years we've been complaining about, you know, about our, you know, having all this foreign currency surplus from the United States, from Europe, and they kept saying, oh, buy something from us. So finally, our government decided to set up CIC, and we got $200 billion. We started trying to buy things in the US and Europe. And we have a policy to be financial investor, totally passive, so we don't invest in anything for more than 10%. And we have all these policies. We look like a perfect, you know, how do you call it? They call it they dump money, right? They say, well, you know, we just put money in, you guys use it, and you give us a little bit of return. And I think that's perfect for you guys. However, you know, right after the financial crisis, 2009, 2010, we started having all these problems. CFIUS started saying, okay, we don't want you to invest in this, we don't want you to invest in that. We were one of the, you know, when we were trying to invest in one company that sets up all these telephone towers, and when we were first given, our share was only 6.7%. It's very little of that, you know, having absolutely nothing to do with it. When we were given that opportunity, I said no. They said, why? I said, well, this looks like this is communications. They may have a problem. And then the, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all these people came to us and said, no, this is different. It's not like in China, because these telephone tower companies are real estate companies. They only have these things, they rent it to other people. They have absolutely nothing to do with the technology. So I said, okay, that's fine. So we started doing it. And we started sharing equally with another Western company to buy that. Then that company was allowed to go, and CFIUS said they don't want us to go in. They wanted us to have all these draconian measures. So I said, what's the problem? And they won't tell us. I had meetings with them time and again. This is all what they call the intelligence community. And they all said, well, we have information that you don't. With that, we can't disclose, but we just don't want you to invest in that. I said, I'll just give you free money for this thing. We only expect a few percentage point of return. And you guys, that company has over 8,000 telephone towers. So what's the problem? They don't tell us. And then they start to go on and on with all these things. With our investment, California wanted us to invest in high-speed railroad. Chicago wanted us to invest in high-speed railroad. Florida, New Jersey, they all talked to us. And eventually nothing happened. Why? Every time someone raised this, some congressman would come out and senators would come and say, oh, we don't want the Chinese money. We do mind the color of the money. Hey, if you don't want that, that's fine. So we started investing in Europe, in the French oil field, in Ireland, in the UK. So I think that there are some people that are having this sort of political, concern in these things that sabotage this. So I think in fact, if you allow people to do that, you can, it's in your country, and these telephone towers is in your places. We can't take anything away, right? So why the hell are you worried so much about that? This doesn't make sense to me, and I think it takes deeper thinking on the political level and say, okay, hey, forget about that. This doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, that's all I have.
Yeah, I do agree that worsening of political relations has made everything more sensitive. So in terms of capital market, we see that Chinese companies going to the US for IPOs has become really hard, especially since DD last year. So what do you think is going to happen? What about those Chinese companies?
I think this is sort of a rule-forming process. We all know that the present relationship has already made it impossible for many of the companies to do things the way they did before. And that I understand, because in early days we didn't understand each other in these things. So things become so much more sophisticated, and people need to reformulate the whole thing. And we need to form new rules so that eventually you understand why we want to do that. We understand why you want to do this. And eventually things would become better. If it doesn't make economic sense or even political sense for either of us to totally stop dealing with each other, because no one is perfect in terms of a trade, in terms of the ability to produce things. So I think eventually, after probably a few years, people would understand more. And now more and more Chinese companies are coming back to China to get listed. But we are, I'm very much involved in the formulation of the Chinese capital market. We have a lot of problems ourselves. And we are learning from you guys, from the Europeans, from everyone else, to try to make our stock market better. But we're never going to be exactly the same, because we're, different cultures. And even, American capital market is different from European market. We studied different models. In the early days, many people advocated the German model, and I was personally very much against it because I studied the German system. I said, oh, it doesn't work for China. American system looks better for us. We think more, similarly. So I think eventually, when you look at all these parameters, eventually when you understand it deeper, then you'll say, okay, it doesn't really matter that much. Let's do things on this side. It doesn't affect that much. I personally was the one to finally persuaded our government to allow companies that produces military equipment to get listed. In the early days, people said, oh, this is totally state secret. I said, look, when I was a lawyer in Wall Street, I took one, I was involved in one of the companies going public. That was one of the major companies making tanks, the cannon, howitzers, all these things. I said, if they don't have a problem, why do we have a problem? And I asked people on Wall Street, I said, why can't these companies to go public? And they said, look, you can only get the financials of these companies. You can't really go in a company and actually look at how they produce the tanks and how the high-tech part of it is being produced. So that's exactly the same here. That's why now China also has some companies that has some military part of that. Every country has that, their own necessity to produce their own things. So eventually when people get more sophisticated, they start to fine-tune these things, and then we can all benefit from that.
Yeah, let's hope the regulators from the two sides can work things out and accelerate this rule-forming process. And next, I want to move to technology sector. I have a number that the Biden administration continued sanctioning China in areas in technologies, and there are 366 China-related bills passed by the U.S. Congress in 2019 to 2021, and half of which are imposing sanctions on Chinese companies or imposing bans on high-tech industries. So I want to go to Mr. Tao first. What do you think about these sanctions? I know you mentioned that before, but specifically about sanctions towards high-tech industries.
Well, I think it is a consistent policy from Donald Trump and until Joe Biden to impose sanctions on high-tech companies of China. And actually, before that, we have a debate between China and the United States about the so-called export control, and I remember clearly during the Obama administration, in the strategic and economic dialogue, U.S. side promised several times to lift or to relax high-tech regulations on China. And once at the end of the dialogue, Minister Chen Deming said something like this: 我们中国人说，一诺千金。We Chinese people say, once promise, that's as way as 1,000 kilometers. Yeah. Now the United States has made 3 promises. We hope they can, translate those promises into practice, but it didn't happen. Yeah. So I think this is an old problem, but of course now it has a new development. And this actually, I think, does harm to both sides. High-tech also need development, and development need money. You sell the high-tech to China, and you got a lot of money. And this will help you develop high money again. And as I said before, if you impose a sanction on high-tech export to China, then China thinks that we have to develop by ourselves. And if we really concentrate on those high-tech development, I think we will do that. So actually, it is it does harm to the both sides, and the U.S. side, of course, will not get any benefit.
And now I want to turn to Mr. Ramo. What do you think about these sanctions? Is there still room and possibilities for cooperation in sectors in technology?
You have to think at the end of the day that the interests of the two sides, I mean, just on an ongoing basis, the amount of interchange that continues to go on, at a working level, I think will continue to drive some degree of cooperation. And I think it's important to keep in mind that you have people, particularly in China, who have been, trained in the U.S., who are immersed in U.S. engineering culture. And it's been interesting to see the way that those links have continued to be durable. So, I think there's definitely a variety of pressures at work on all sides. But fundamentally, the nature of technology is it seeks the best way to solve problems. And in many cases, the best way to solve problems is cooperatively.
And I want to go back about the point we raised earlier about the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, because it does not only stress technology competition, but also it tries to pose its allies, especially democracies, with a similar economy path to defend the crucial supply chains and technology infrastructures. So do you think this kind of approach will accelerate the dividing in the technology competition, the landscape?
I think if you really want to examine this from a kind of philosophical perspective, it can be of some help, which is that, the nature of the way in which technology distributes itself around the world and affects everything from supply chains to production lines to innovation and research is also in the process of being changed. So you're not dealing with a ceteris paribus environment. You're dealing with one that's changing very dramatically. One interesting way to think about, just take kind of a limited example from the world of technology design itself. If you look at the structure of computing systems over the last couple of decades, they've moved, if you were involved in computer programming like I was in the early days for me, the early days, the 80s and the 90s, you had systems that were totally dependent on files that ran locally on individual machines. And what changed during the period of the 1990s and 2000s, you had more and more connectivity, is that you had systems that began to be determined by something that's called dependencies. So if you have a website that you built in 1995 and you decided you wanted to start it up again today, you probably still have all those files sitting on your computer and you can take a look at it. If you try to reboot a website from 2010 that has all these dependencies built into it, you'll find that it's very hard to restart it because connectivity was a fundamental element of the design of those systems. We're moving now from a world of just kind of pure files over to a world of dependencies. And now you're starting to see some pressure. People would like to go back to a world of files, right? If you think about this on a macroeconomic basis, people want to have control of their resources. They want to have control over all their production. Even though, as we said earlier, from a Ricardo perspective, from an information theory perspective, there's a lot of reasons why you should have a comparative advantage approach. What we see emerging today on the other side of these dependencies is something that's known as a compositional model of technology. And what a compositional model is it involves combining many different pieces that have the ability to interact and interrelate with each other in different ways at different times. I'm ultimately a believer that technology is a prime force in driving the architectures of the civilizations around them, something known as Conway's Law, named after Melvin Conway, the famous engineer of telephone systems. This idea that you ship your org chart, that systems redesign themselves to be efficient based on the technology topologies they have to operate on. So I think that's certainly what's coming for trade in a world where digital trade is important, where the information content of products, meaning that the electrons that go with every product that is made out of atoms, also have an important element to say. That is the structure that is driving the underlying logic of trade. And I think we're in a global transformation towards that new model of trade.
Yeah, but still, at the same time, the competition in technology is going on. And now I want to turn to Mr. Orleans here about the point you raised earlier about subsidies, because we noticed in the American Competition Act 2022, it allocates $300 billion in R&D subsidies to areas in semiconductors and so on. But the U.S. has been criticizing China for its subsidies to state-owned corporations. So do you think that is a clear double standard?
Disclosure. Gao Xiqing can tell you all about disclosure, having formerly worked in public issues. The WTO actually, as part of accession, both the United States and China are required to disclose subsidies so people understand them, that competitors understand them. China is not disclosing those subsidies. I don't agree with this bill that is providing, in fact, basic R&D is perfectly fine for governments to fund, and it's perfectly fine to fund defense expenditures. To fund, as this bill does, $50 billion in semiconductor manufacturing when semiconductor companies in the United States make tens of billions of dollars in profit does not seem to be a wise use of government funds. However, it is fully disclosed. This is an elected legislature, and they made this decision to do that. So I think it's not a double standard. But having said that, it's the two, this decision to put 50 billion into semiconductor manufacturing brings the United States closer to the Chinese model. So rather than deciding, as the party Congress did in 2013, that market forces should be primary, we're putting the state more in the process. So the United States is actually following what China has done, but China clearly is having the state sector and state banks and other state enterprises participate in the economy more and more, and we've seen a reverse. So from my early years in China, the private sector grew and grew and became the driver of Chinese economic development. What we've seen in the last several years is a slowing down of the private sector, increasing in the state sector's participation in the economy. And I think the people on this call agree that private sector companies are more profitable and create more growth per dollar than state sector companies. So this is going to have consequences for China's economic growth. I think we're already seeing consequences for China's economic growth.
Yeah, Ms. Scott, please.
So the
I know you have
answer to your
something to
question
say.
is, yeah. Xiping, what do you have to say?
Yeah, Steve, I would like to respond to that respectively. In fact, when you look at the dynamics of this, I always keep wondering why Americans are so worried about China going into this new stage of what they call 国进民退, that the state supporting SOEs and sort of disfavoring private enterprise. I said, look, if you guys believe, you guys are very confident about your system, and as we are about our system, but not as confident as you guys about yours. If you believe that your private enterprise, your capitalist system is going to work, and our system doesn't work as well, so why are you so worried about the way that goes contrary to the road that that you were advocating and we were advocating in the early days of reform? But now, I personally was involved in at least a dozen state enterprises being remedied by the country, by the state, being infused with all the money, trying to save them. Personally, over the past 30 years, I've been through every one of them. Very few really was saved. Every one eventually fell apart. At the same time, wasting millions of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. So, last time when we were having this conference, I just said, look, I'll give you examples, like the Tianjin Dawufeng, the big seamless steel pipe company, like the film company, like the colored tubes, TV tubes in Shanxi, all these companies, one by one, being saved by the state sector, by the local government, all the central government, and eventually they all fell apart. And early days, we also spent billions of dollars on chip companies, and it didn't work. So why is that? We're not going into a philosophical issue, but what I'm saying is that if you guys are so confident about the system, why do you worry about it? You say, okay, just let it do. If the Chinese government wants to subsidize your companies by selling things to us, that's all the benefit for us, right? Americans get the benefit because you buy cheaper things, because part of the price that you ought to have been paid was paid by the Chinese government. So that, to me, it's just counterintuitive, right? So let's face it. You said state subsidizing R&D is all right, and state subsidizing companies are not all right. To me, well, look, they are more or less the same, right? I'm personally involved in quite a few investment things in the U.S. I know how American universities, research institutes are being subsidized by the state, by the various U.S. Department of, anywhere ranging from defense to health, billions of dollars into it. Today, the competition in this world is concentrating much more on the technology side, much more on the R&D side. So that's the same thing. Why are you worried? Just if you can see that, you say, okay, why don't we just, I agree with you, disclosure is important, but we're not, on a company level, probably, as you say, well, you're not disclosing enough. Well, because, that's not only because the government, doing it, every company's doing it, all these private companies going abroad, trying to get listed. I was a regulator. I tried so hard to, find the things behind every company that's trying to defraud the investors to benefit their own. But that's a common problem everywhere. So why, I agree. Let's say, you try to disclose what you do to support your companies or support your industries, but let's accept each other. There's one clause in the U.S. Immigration law in the 1920s which says no member of the Communist Party should be allowed to get into the United States, right? But since then, millions of Communist Party members throughout the world got into the United States. Why? Because there was one clause, I think it's 212, paren 3, paren E, whatever, in your immigration law that it provided an exemption for the Russians in the 1930s, okay? So that's why all these Chinese people could get into the US because of these things. And that's, I think it is, again, coming back, the dialogue, connectivity is important, and realization of differences. And so that you don't concentrate on these little things. Technically, you say, oh, this is a violation. Hey, look at your violation on all these things. So, let's try to talk and try to bring things to the surface and talk to people and say, okay, let's make it open. Then we deal with each other on that basis.
Okay. And I believe the subject is, yes, Mr. Lee.
Well, Xi-Ching, what you said is precisely that people in U.S. increasingly lack of confidence and driven by fear and or mutually reinforced fear in terms of technological arena. So geopolitical fault lines are beginning to form, with technology being a central domain of competition. You look at some sectors like 5G. It's not so much about which country builds 5G faster and better, but the choice of the two communication skills and the two different frequency bands. So it will determine that whether China or the United States will be the leader in communications over the next 10 to 20 years. It's related with national security from US perspective, maybe also from Chinese perspective as well. And also that in 2020, Huawei 5G-based stations account for 700,000, 70% of the world total. And the following year, 2021, they built again 600,000. So you can see dominated the world. That's why US wanted to American allies in Europe to boycott Huawei's 5G. I'm not saying that it's the right approach, but that's the reality. That also related with the US made the chips, dropped from 37% in the world in 1990 to now 12%. So that's why US obsessed with the launching the chip alliance or semiconductor industry alliance. This also explained the Commerce Secretary really said that a few months ago that the American allies should restrict the export of sensitive technology to curb China's pace of innovation. It's really 吃相难看, but that's the reality that the US policymakers reflect Washington and also broader community. So that's the reality we face. Now, you and I both came to the United States in the 1980s, but that was a different era. But now, we are really shocked by some of the things occur, mainly it's what American domestic politics become so toxic, and partly because of China's ever-growing power and influence, whether you perceive the right way or wrong way, but that's the two things reinforce each other. So make the relationship is such difficult in this period. I really appreciate your analysis of human nature. I think you also in good sense about the common sense. These are very, very important. But at this difficult moment, people are not driven by this goodwill, common sense, or human nature, but it's by the really different things. This otherwise you cannot explain Donald Trump phenomenon. So the U.S. policy towards China from Donald Trump to Biden, the continuity show it's not just individual, it's something bigger, deeper. So over, yeah. This is again, it's not a criticism. Actually, it's more praise. But I want to interpret in an American perspective, look at the technological competition, that issue.
Thank you so much for raising that excellent point. And because of time, we're going to close our forum today. But before we close, I want to ask each of you a very quick question. Because we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Shanghai Communique. And by some means, Shanghai Communique is a very special communique. It does not only state the common sense, the common ground, the consensus of the two sides, but also it has stated the difference. It has acknowledged the difference between the two sides. So what kind of wisdom, or if you're going to make a suggestion, what would that be? And please, let's start with our guest here. Mr. Gao, please.
Well, if I can say one thing, I really would like our world leaders, both sides of the Pacific and really everyone else, to be as philosophical and as open-minded as Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, Richard Nixon, Dr. Kissinger. If that happens, I hope that happens eventually.
Mr. Tao, please.
Well, in spite of 20 years, more than 20 years, confrontation and separation. Both leaders, both United States and Chinese leaders, recognized that the time has changed. Time has changed. United States and China would not go to war again. No war between U.S. and China. But Soviet Union now poses a great threat to both the United States and China. During the Cultural Revolution, one sentence repeated again in Renmin Ribao is that the Soviet Union deployed 1 million troops along the China-Soviet and China-Mongolia border. So the Soviet Union posed a great threat to our security. Then, after all that, U.S. and China went together. Then, because of beginning of a reconciliation between the two countries, we not just brought the benefits to both countries, but also ended the Cold War in Asia. 10 years before the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union ended. And that created a very favorable environment for Asia-Pacific region to develop economically. And this has provided such a good environment. So I think the Nixon's ice-breaking journey and the releasing of Shanghai Communique is a remarkable event in the history, not just the Sino-American relations, but also in the world.
Yeah, and we'll go online to our guest, Mr. Ramo here, please.
Sure. First of all, thank you for coordinating this event on this important occasion. I'm reminded of a comment that Dr. Kissinger often has made to me, which is that the greatest risk for the new generation is that we don't have any memory or experience of tragedy. And I think that is an element which informed the thinking of everybody who was meeting 50 years ago today to try to find a way forward. And I think that's the first important point to keep in mind, that our obligation, first of all, is peace, And the second obligation is to solve the tremendous problems of the world that are out there today that face all of humanity equally. And I think when considered on that basis, in that larger context, hopefully it becomes possible for the countries to find ways to bring their interests into alignment. That's the difficult work of diplomacy, but it's not insoluble. And it's a reminder that the great tragedy of our age may not be a US-China conflict or a war, but it might instead be a failure to cooperate on the kinds of problems around the world that really at this point are existential problems for the human race.
Okay, next, Mr. Lee, please.
Well, just like my girlfriend, Joshua Ramo, I also want to say a few things about Dr. Kissinger. And he is the strategist of the century, in my view, who made the change happen and who brought hope from despair. As I said, that at period 50 years ago, Cold War, Cultural Revolution, both are going on. He learned from the past and he helped create a better future. Now, his forthcoming book entitled Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy, should continue to inspire us in today's world. And Dr. Henry Kissinger also recently pointed out that the United States and China today are almost equally powerful. This has never happened before in the contemporary world, according to Dr. Kissinger. Either country cannot win a total war or destroy the other. Therefore, the two countries and the international communities need to find an entirely new way to coexist. Over.
And Mr. Orleans, at last, I want you to conclude, please.
The genius of the Shanghai Communique was the boldness and the wisdom of the leadership that Secretary Kissinger, President Nixon, Chairman Mao, and Zhou Enlai overcame what was more than 2 decades of estrangement, where the two systems were fundamentally different, to kind of put in place a structure that led to 50 years of peace. Tonight, as during our 2-hour conversation, there's reports that shelling is heard in Kiev, and reports from American reporters near the Russian military that artillery is being fired by the Russian military. It's important, it's critical that we use the spirit of the Shanghai Communique and the wisdom of the leadership then to come to today and get the Chinese and American leadership to talk about what we should do in this crisis. That this stark Russian aggression would deeply offend Zhou Enlai because it violates a tenet of the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China since its formation in 1949. So we need to use the Shanghai Communique, use what Zhou Enlai and Secretary Kissinger talked about, and find a way to make today's world more peaceful and prosperous, because I'm deeply worried about what these events, which we're experiencing right now, are going to do to the prospects for US-China relations. So let's use the spirit of the Shanghai Communique to help resolve these issues.
Well, thank you so much for your excellent points. And the world we're living in is really different from what we were 50 years ago, but still we can draw wisdom from history and the spirit of Shanghai Communique. So that's all for our forum in the morning today and for you in the evening. And thank you all for participating. Thank you. Have a good night. Have a good day.
And
Thank you.
Ramu, Steve, Lee Cheng, hi. Happy New Year.
Nice to see you all.
Great to see you. I can't wait to see you in person.
虎年大吉。
Okay, good. Okay.